Hey everybody, Ed here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share a comparison between the Sony Cyber-shot RX100 here on the left and the RX100 Mark II on the right. So first and foremost, let's talk about pricing. You're looking at $649.99 and $749.99. Those are both retail here in the US. So these two models are only separated by 100. Again, that is retail. The RX100 has been on the market for a significantly longer period of time, and as a result, pricing will reflect that. So in terms of the $100 price gap, I'll say immediately the Mark II is definitely the camera to pick over and over again. However, if you're looking at a $300 price gap between these two models because you found a good deal on the 100, then I'm going to have to recommend the RX100 over and over again unless you absolutely have to have some of the features that I'm going to share with all of you today through the course of this video, because the RX100 redefined expectations. It's a beast of a little camera, and in terms of what it's able to pull off for a pocketable point and shoot, there's nothing else like it on the market, and that's part of the reason that Sony hasn't replaced it but merely complemented it here with the Mark II. So with that said, let's start off with what's probably most important to all of you, the sensor and lens. They are identical in these cameras, which is part of the reason that many will argue that the RX100 is a significantly better purchase any day of the week, and I can understand that logic. They do share, again, the same 1-inch sensor, also the same exact Carl Zeiss f1.8 glass, 3.6 times optical zoom, so just enough to make this a serviceable all-in-one travel-friendly camera in my opinion. And because it can actually fit in a regular pocket, not just a cargo pocket, it really can go anywhere. So you've got great image and video quality anywhere you go. No excuse really anymore to not be taking your camera out of the house, which is part of what I love about both of these models. So it's great that you've got that sensor lens combo that is really unmatched, as I've said already. But what the Mark II does a little bit better is low light performance, and that's because even though it has the same sensor, it captures light differently. Rather than being front illuminated like the sensor in the original RX100, Sony has redesigned, or I should say tweaked, this sensor so that it is back illuminated, thus allowing for a great improvement in low light capability. And that's from the person who's always going to leave it in auto up to a person who really has taken the time to learn the camera and knows what they're doing with the Mark II. So you're going to get better overall images across the board, but specifically low light I think is an important one for just about everyone. And that, in my opinion, is the biggest gain with the newer Mark II. But moving along, as you may have noticed, very similar in terms of design. Both cameras have basically an all-metal construction. The Mark II, again, which is here in my right hand, is a little bit thicker, and that's because it does have quite a bit more action crammed into it. You've got a tilting screen as opposed to the fixed LCD screen on the RX100. There are also some design cue differences as well as ports, which I'll get into through the course of this video. So first and foremost, let's start off with the back of the camera. So I mentioned that the screen now tilts on the Mark II, and it does. It articulates, and certainly that, like most of the updated features on the Mark II, could be looked at as a gimmick that really isn't necessary. When it comes to a photographic tool, the RX100 really does just about everything. Granted, it does not have the Wi-Fi, NFC, hot shoe, step zoom, all of those things that I think are great enhancements that I'm going to talk about. This camera still does exactly what it should. It takes great stills and great video while still being able to fit in your pocket. Battery life is also really solid, but I will tell you battery life is improved in the newer Mark II. So considering the Mark II has gained a lot of features, good to see that the battery life has improved rather than decreased. But again, back to the rear of the camera's design is almost identical. I'll give you a nice close-up here so you can see exactly what I'm speaking about. Literally no change. Even the thumb grip is identical, and generally speaking, Sony does change that thumb grip generation to generation. Keep in mind, the Mark II is not a new generation, so that might be why just about everything has stayed the same with improvements only. So back of the camera, the only real difference is instead of being stuck with that fixed LCD, you now have a screen that gives you some range of motion so that if you don't decide to pick up an external viewfinder, or you want to get some high or low shots without breaking your neck, you have that ability with the tiltable screen. And the tiltable screen really does not add that much thickness, so I really think it's an important feature on this new model, even though, again, many will say there's nothing wrong with a fixed LCD screen like the original 100 Sports. And I really won't argue against that, but the fact that a camera with a tilting screen does now exist, it's just another option. And I think that's what Sony's done really well here, is that they've given two different cameras with very similar performance up to two different prospective clients in terms of what you need. And I know there are a lot of people out there that even if the low light performance of the Mark II isn't something to put them over the edge, the tiltable screen may very well be one of those things. Now, the flash is pretty much identical, again, like most of this camera. Your zoom rocker here to control that 3.6 times Zeiss glass is exactly the same. You have clear image zoom on both of these cameras. In fact, everything is the same in terms of software and functionality, although I do find things a little bit quicker on the Mark II, specifically the precision of that step zoom, something that you do not have here in the original RX100. Your mode dial also, again, the same. There's no deviation here, no reason for deviation, because that lens sensor combo that the original 100 brought to the table, again, is still the best in the marketplace. So no reason to change control. That wasn't really a big complaint. Now, the hot shoe, you may have noticed here as we're looking at the top, is a pretty big design cue difference. And that's something the RX100 doesn't have. And that's certainly something I was hoping that the Mark II would integrate. And luckily, they did. Now, most of you may scoff at the multi-interface shoe on a camera like this. Granted, it's a $750 camera. It's very expensive. It's more expensive than an NEX5R or 5T. Of course, not necessarily the same price as an NEX6 unless you get a great deal. But I think at that price point, it does justify the option to get a viewfinder. Now, the viewfinder that's currently available is $450. I have covered it. Check out my videos. It is a great piece of kit, especially when you own multiple Sony cameras that it can be used across, like the RX1, HX50V like myself, and here in the Mark II. However, I know most people that purchase this won't be necessarily apt to shell out that extra $450. What I will say is that it's better to have the hot shoe than not. Not only because, of course, there are a lot of other accessories right now. You've also got an external microphone for less than $150 that you could use for this, which will give you much better directional audio than what you'll get from the onboard microphone in this camera, or of course in the original RX100, which again completely lacks the multi-interface shoe option. So you're never going to have this sort of flexibility with the original 100. So what might seem trivial here really isn't, in my opinion. And also, third-party options may come up down the road. Sony may even expand their portfolio. I think they will continue to expand their portfolio of optional accessories for the multi-interface hot shoe, which means you may see less expensive viewfinders down the road. And of course, if you have the original RX100 with no hot shoe, you're not going to have the ability to pick up that new inexpensive viewfinder that Sony started making because they realized people weren't buying the $450 one for this or the HX50V. Because, in my opinion, that's really the driving force for Sony to make a viewfinder that's less expensive. Cameras like the HX50V that are in a lower price range, almost half of the cost of the Mark II, but still have the ability to take on something like a EVF or external mic, among other things. External flash, of course, is another great add-on for this camera. So whether you're looking for that EVF, flash, or microphone, keep in mind that's not going to happen here on the 100. That doesn't take away from the imaging and video capability that this package presents, but it's something that is noteworthy. So far I've talked about low light and the hot shoe. I've also mentioned the step zoom ring. That may be critical for some of you, others not so much. The next thing I want to talk about is battery life. The RX100 did pretty well. However, the Mark II actually improves. It's not a big jump, not a significant one, but still noteworthy. That's why I'm mentioning it. This is all about the performance between these two cameras, and that happens to be one area where the Mark II bests the 100. As you can see from a top profile here, again, they're almost identical, just a little bit thicker here on the Mark II. and of course you've got the extra bump here for the interface shoe. Microphones still in the same position pretty much, a little bit closer here on the Mark II, but in my experience, performance is pretty much identical. If I pick up the cameras, I want to show the actual right side, because this is where we go to on both cameras for ports, generally speaking. And this again shows some of the design changes. Also speaking to the feedback that Sony took from customers and applied here in this product. So on the original RX100, your HDMI connection was right there underneath the tripod mount. Not exactly the best place, I think, in anyone's opinion. Of course, the SD card slot and battery compartment, exact same place that it is on the Mark II. That has not changed. But as you may notice here, the HDMI is no longer on the bottom of the Mark II. The HDMI has been relocated right here to the side of the camera. So we now have what Sony has dubbed, rather than just a simple charging port here on the 100, a multi-interface port. So much like our multi-interface shoe, we now have a multi-interface port. And while you may think, oh, that's just for charging, what's the big deal? No, it's called multi because it's got different functions. Now, presently, that's pretty much centered around an accessory I've already shared, which is this little nifty remote, which just hooks up right here via USB to that multi-interface port, and basically gives you a shutter control, zoom control, record for video, everything you could possibly need that you could never have with the original RX100, at least from a remote control standpoint at the most basic form. That remote is the RM-VPR1. It's going to run you roughly $65. It's not inexpensive, but it's something you simply cannot do with the RX100. So I find that to be noteworthy because it's yet another thing that I think people overlook. They think it's an insignificant thing or just another accessory for Sony to sell, but that multi-port really can be expanded. In terms of other remotes Sony might want to design for a camera like this, we might see things like time-lapse, among other things, because unfortunately, even though this camera, the Mark II, does have Wi-Fi and NFC capability, you see the Wi-Fi branding right there on the left side of the camera, it unfortunately doesn't have the Play Memories app store that you'll find with the NEX line of cameras. And that was probably the most disappointing thing for me with the Mark II. Maybe that's reserved for the next generation, the true successor to the original RX100, and now, of course, the Mark II as well. But it's likely that Sony's keeping that in the NEX and maybe expanding it to the Alpha line, keeping it in another tier of camera in the interchangeable lens area. Although I'd also like to see it on cameras like the next version of the RX1, but I digress. The point is that if we have to install the Play Memories app and we have Wi-Fi and NFC, I really can't see any excuse for Sony not including the Play Memories app store to this camera. It seems to have all the right hardware, and it certainly is more expensive than the NEX 5R or 5T, which the 5T just launched, which does incorporate NFC, arguably its only real enhancement over the 5R, which did already have Wi-Fi for connectivity. Of course, NFC is a critical one. I'll be getting to that in a moment. But that does have access to the App Store, and the 5T tops out as a kit at $600. So $150 less than this camera, but we don't have access to any of those apps. That is a disappointment for me with the Mark II. Would have liked to have seen it, but maybe Sony thinks we need to pay more. I'm not sure. I think that's what it has to do with. But again, since the 5R and T are less expensive, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But now let's focus on that Wi-Fi and NFC. Because again, not a lot of difference in the thickness here, but we have a tilting screen now, which of course adds to the form factor on the Mark II, but also inside the camera, more going on. We have near-field communication, which you can see before I was showing the bottom of the camera. I was showing you that the HDMI port has been relocated. It's no longer on the bottom, but now on the side of the camera. which I think almost every user is going to be happy with, as I mentioned. But we've also got our NFC connectivity point. Now, with other Sony cameras, Wi-Fi control was a capability that was there. However, you had to go through a mating process that was relatively clunky. With NFC, all you have to do is tap that point on the bottom of the camera to your NFC point on your respective smartphone or tablet, and boom, you've got instant pairing and control of the Mark II. That is a feature, again, that is more of a gimmick and not a reason to pick the Mark II over the Mark I, the original RX100, but it is something that I think speaks to the fact that the Mark II is a modern camera rather than just the tool that the 100 represents. More polish, more emphasis on bells and whistles, but practical ones. These are not useless ones. The Wi-Fi, on the other hand, which if you own an iPhone, you're going to be stuck with using Wi-Fi, unfortunately for you. And I say that not because the Wi-Fi doesn't work. It is serviceable, but I can tell you right now, as someone who's worked with all of Sony's Wi-Fi-enabled cameras, while it's serviceable, it won't necessarily be a go-to the way NFC changes the game. NFC makes me want to use my smartphone as a viewfinder and control a control mechanism, really, for the camera, rather than what the Wi-Fi presented itself as. The Wi-Fi, again, just was more cumbersome, and it is there, which is a good thing, but also less reliable and just not as quick. The fact that the NFC activates itself within seconds speaks to the usability. So NFC, a huge feature in my opinion, but definitely one of the more novelty items compared to what I've discussed so far, because everything else I've discussed about the Mark II, when compared to what's missing from the 100 and how it's added the hot shoe, the screen, the step zoom. I also haven't mentioned video modes. In the Mark II, you gain, you're able to shoot in the highest AVC HD format in 60p and 24p. Of course, 1080p video. The RX100 is not capable of both of those modes. So that's another area where the Mark II just is a more well-rounded version of the 100. Not a replacement, but a more rounded version. More feature-rich and laden, of course, that's part of the price point difference. The sensor, again, does yield better performance, but it's still the same sensor. And that's why if you can get the 100 on sale, it's a steal, because you're getting essentially the same kit as the Mark II, just less intelligence and photographic flexibility because of that multi-interface hot shoe and the multi-interface port for remotes. I mean, if they end up launching less expensive or third-party accessories for both the interface shoe as well as the interface port for wired remotes of all different sorts to accommodate the fact that there are no Play Memory apps, like I've mentioned before, that I'd like to use with this since I gotta go through the Sony software, then I think the Mark II really does yet again represent a different camera than the 100, even though they're pretty much exactly the same form factor. Sony does now also manufacture a grip. I recommend picking that up for those of you who don't feel comfortable with holding this, either the 100 or Mark II, because it isn't, ergonomically speaking, the best designed camera for actually gripping. I mean, if you have incredibly small hands, then you might be very comfortable, but even average hands are going to feel somewhat cramped on these cameras. But that is a very small price to pay for the performance you get out of both of these models. And that's the reason that they're both incredibly popular. When I first saw the 100 launched at $650, I thought Sony was a little bit crazy. I think most people did, until they saw actual results and got one in their hands and used it. Then they realized, for many out there, either of these cameras could easily replace that entry-level digital SLR or NEX or Micro Four Thirds camera and really become the go-to for just about everything. With that said, I think it still makes a phenomenal backup camera or even third camera, depending on what type of user you actually are. But there's no question that the person who wants more flexibility, better overall picture quality and video capability, as well as just the more polished product, has to go to the Mark II. And that's why I personally am sticking with the Mark II. The 100 is still the beast that changed the game. There's no question about that. Nothing can be taken away from the 100, but things can be improved upon, and that's what this newer Mark II is all about. In terms of cases, they do make jacket cases for both of these cameras, and they're both quite nice and overpriced. $80 for the case I reviewed here for the Mark II. The case originally designed for the RX100, also originally retailed for $80. You can now pick it up for around $50. I'll have links in the description for both of these cameras to pick up through Amazon. And really, quite frankly, whichever one you go with, you will not be disappointed. I know the prices, or the pricing, I should say, is intimidating. But once you realize that the size is not relative to performance these days, you'll be very glad you picked up one of these, because at the end of the day, as I mentioned through most of my camera videos, reviews, and impressions, a camera is all about the use you actually are able to have of it. And if your camera is sitting at home collecting dust rather than traveling with you, it's really not going to equate to anything more than the sum of its hardware, which is nothing in the real world. And to me, that's where the RX100 and Mark II specifically shine, because the portability factor equates to usability, and really the best camera, again, is the one that you can take with you. And if there was only one camera I could pick on a day-to-day basis, it would definitely be either of these. But again, the Mark II is my camera of choice. If I had to step up, then I'm at the RX1. If I need interchangeable lenses, that's another story entirely. But both of these cameras are great. Build quality, as I mentioned, the same on both of these. They're both made in China. Those of you looking for made in Japan models, you're not going to find them. The first run of RX100s were made in Japan, but after that, no longer. All camera manufacturing by Sony has been shifted to China, and quite frankly, the stigma associated with inferiority should be dropped at this point, especially if you've used any of Sony's made in China cameras as of late, specifically either of these models, because they're still best in class. So build quality, these are built like tanks. In fact, they could probably damage, if you're not careful with them, some of your larger entry-level digital SLRs, which are far more polycarbonate than either of these little metallic beasts. The microphone here on the RX100, another instance of redesign. On the Mark II, you can see it's been relocated to the bottom of the camera. So again, little design cues changed, but overall, much of the same here in terms of the actual design and performance, as I've said through the course of this video. Just some small differences in actual design as well as the actual specifications, which end up, in my opinion, delivering two very different cameras. Even though they seem very similar, again, the flexibility of the Mark II makes it an entirely different beast, a better beast in my opinion. But if you don't need any of these things like the tiltable screen, the step zoom, the hot shoe, Wi-Fi, NFC, then there's no reason to even think about purchasing the RX100. Again, these are the best point-and-shoot pocketable zoom cameras on the market, and for many of you, I think really this can be your go-to for just about everything, except for instances when you need a little bit more telephoto capability. Clear zoom is there, which is a form of cropping, basically. Definitely superior to a traditional digital zoom, and all of the software and general features are the same on these two cameras, as I've mentioned through the course of the video. So really, at the end of the day, for me personally, most of the changes, the upgrades I've mentioned here that many deem insignificant, are definitely, in my opinion, critical and well worth the premium in price, unless, again, we're talking about $300, because that's almost the price principally of the RX100 to begin with. At that point, you're getting to, half of the original retail almost. So if that's the case, then, as I said at the very beginning, not that this is reincorporation, you stick with the RX100. But to me personally, the better low light performance, the hot shoe, the tilt screen, multi-terminal and its maturation both in the hot shoe and the wired terminal itself are critical. And I've said it over and over again, but it's just really important for those of you who are investing a lot of money in either of these cameras to know. And just the ability to have that EVF, I think, is also a game breaker for many out there, and that's one of the reasons they wouldn't buy the original RX100, believe it or not, for those of you who think the RX100 is already way too expensive at even its reduced price point. Also, I mentioned 3 or 4 times already that step zoom, the slightly longer battery life. These are important things. And better video capability. Those all add up to me to be the better camera, the more complete package, and I'll always recommend the Mark II to anybody who's fresh to the market. Again, if you already own the RX100, I would hang out and wait to see what else Sony has in store for us over the course of the next month and in 2014, because a lot of good things are coming out in all sorts of forms, especially in the full frame variety. Again, that's not going to be pocketable like this, but Sony's got a lot of tricks up their sleeves. They really are innovating right now, and that's what the Mark II speaks of, or speaks to, in my opinion. They didn't try to redefine the game like they did with the RX100, but rather just make it even better. But overall, love both of these cameras. Can highly recommend either of them. But if you need all of those aforementioned upgrades, then you shouldn't even be thinking. Go out there and get yourself the Mark II. And even though both of these are expensive, as I've mentioned over and over again, you're going to find that you will get prolonged use and a lot of enjoyment out of them. They're both, as I would say, happy cameras, because you're just not going to be displeased with them in any form or fashion. Even autofocus, which is probably the biggest gripe that I've heard about with either of these models. And quite frankly, again, when it comes to pocket cameras, even in that arena, they kill the competition. If you guys have any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. And of course, as usual, please feel free to subscribe. Later.